Well, friends, welcome. Vancouver School of Theology is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We are grateful for their stewardship of the land through the centuries. My name is Richard Topping. I'm the president of VST. This afternoon, at least in Vancouver, we're going to hear the fourth and final lecture in this series, Indigenizing Canada, by the Reverend Dr Ray Aldridge. Ray is a husband, a father, and a grandfather. He's status Cree from the Swan River Band, Treaty 8, and he's the director of the Indigenous Studies Program at the Vancouver School of Theology. Ray, you will know by now, tells difficult truths with kindness and understanding, with empathy and insight, and often with humor. And for that, his colleagues and students or friends are grateful. Last night, I should tell you, I saw Ray smile broadly. 6 students graduated from VST with their MDiv through the Indigenous Studies Program last night. And that's just outstanding, the most ever. I want to congratulate Ray on this important work at her school. And we would be happy to talk to you about courses at VST and how you can support the Indigenous Studies Program. Tonight, Ray is going to address us on the topic of Indigenizing Canada, reconciliation as a journey and destination. And when Ray's completed his presentation, there'll be opportunity for questions and conversations. You can type your questions in the question and answer function or use the chat box. Welcome, Ray.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here again. And like you said, Richard, this is the 4th lecture. I thank you for the opportunity to express myself about these ideas, because I really do. Maybe you're supposed to use writing for other things, but I really do use it to try to think through things, try to understand issues. I entitled the talk Reconciliation as a Journey and Destination because I was trying to avoid entering back into a problem-solving view that traps so many of us modern people and limits our understanding when it comes to trying to understand complex issues. When it comes to reconciliation, it has tended to be regarded, at least since the mid-1990s, as an event that you did that would cure the problem so then you could move on with life as you knew it before. And there was the idea that reconciliation was a thing that you had to do in order so you could sort of put that aside and go on to the important business of building some kind of kingdom or some kind of institution. And I didn't want to do, I don't want us to think like that when it comes to reconciliation. Maybe we're so focused on sort of finding the silver bullet that's going to solve the problem or slay the demon or the dragon. That's maybe in the church we tend towards that thinking because the result of our inclination to think of salvation in terms of some kind of event that is gonna. We've had a prosperity gospel, and I always think maybe part of that thinking is that once you solve the problem of salvation, then you can go on to have lots of friends, lots of money, and all your diseases will be cured. And that's just not reality. That's not reality. Also, I wanted to think about reconciliation as a journey and destination. I wanted to think, I was also trying to battle against the idea that our tendency these days to really want to be able to do whatever we want in our pursuit of happiness and personal fulfillment. And again, when it comes to reconciliation, it means then it's looked at as something that you have to do to deal with a difficult situation in the most efficient means. And thus we want an event that will put an end to strife and enable us to move along in our quest for the good life. At the same time, I don't want to make reconciliation as journey something that ended up as another purpose-driven something. And purpose is important, but it seems like a lot of times people use these purposes or these things as it sort of it manufactures a flurry of activity and even creation of institutions, but doesn't actually change our character or how we live with one another. Modern society, I've noticed, and even sometimes in the Christian church, arms itself with new purpose and goal, and then in this search or in the quest for this sacrifice and goal, this new purpose, the church sacrifices people and land to this new institution of reconciliation. I want to make sure we understood reconciliation as seeking, as the TRC report defines, as seeking to establish and maintain mutual beneficial relationship. I want to avoid making reconciliation into another religious thing that we do so that we feel better. Dallas Willard, in a book called Divine Conspiracy, said that much of the Western church engages in sin management techniques. They're attempts to make us feel good about our lives without actually working to change our character. I want to talk about reconciliation as a journey that is transformative, and really reconciliation is the journey that we're on in this life, and that's what I wanted us to think about it. I was struck too. I was impacted. I wish I could remember. I just thought of it now, that part of scripture that says building yourselves, building up one another in love. And I was thinking about how love is, how I understood that looking through the indigenous eyes of my ancestors, was that love was both the goal, the means, and the measure to what it was to be a human being. And so that's why I came up with this title for this lecture. And then my thesis is reconciliation aims at transformation, but it's a transformation that is ongoing. The practice of being human in relationship as understood by Indigenous people will help us develop an understanding of reconciliation that is not something you achieve and leave behind, but one that is ever growing. Seen in this way, reconciliation is a journey and a destination full of celebration and purpose. So that's my plan for today. So reconciliation is transformation. I want to think about reconciliation as transformation because decolonization requires a change of our heart and character. Decolonization is not something you can sort of achieve just by incremental application of policy. Of course, as soon as I say that, there'll be an academic who writes a paper that proves that it's not true and you can achieve that. But my experience is that if you want to see reconciliation, it's deeply personal and spiritual, and it does not come about by decree of law, but put into place. It doesn't come about by the decree of some larger institution. Reconciliation is about being transformed as human beings and forming a grassroots movement that will impact institutions and laws. I used to see that one of the things that happened in Indigenous communities that I observed when I was the director of the First Nations Alliance Churches of Canada, and it's actually talked about a little bit in a book called Dissonant Worlds. It's about a priest who goes to work up in the Wabasca area in northern Alberta in the 1950s. And he observes, he's a Catholic priest, but at one point there's a Christian Missionary Alliance church that comes, and half of his congregation ends up in this new Christian Missionary Alliance church. That's, I think I've told this story before, but Clarence Jaycox is the minister, and his wife Ruth. They're up there by the Christian Missionary Alliance doing mission work among Indigenous people, and they convince half of the Catholics to become Christian Missionary Alliance. But then a little while later, there's a Pentecostal group that comes into the community, and they take half of the Alliance Church, ends up over in the Pentecostal group. And then this Catholic priest writes about going to visit Clarence and Ruth, where they commiserate the loss of people in their respective parishes or ministers. I was thinking about that later I was asked by people in the community to talk about reconciliation there. I remember they invited me to speak at a camp, because even if you didn't talk about the Catholic Church, even in the Pentecostal and the Christian Missionary Alliance Church, there were brothers and families who were split about where to go to church. They were going to church in different places. And they wanted to move together in reconciliation. But typically what happened when churches go in to try to resolve schisms is they do it by scolding people and telling them what they're doing wrong. And it seemed to me that the first step in reconciliation is acknowledging the validity of the other. If you don't want to acknowledge the other, then you never actually move together. It needed to be this transformation that happened inside, that we needed to understand one another. So it's a process. The process of reconciliation needs institutions to make space for it to occur, but institutions need to understand that there's something greater than themselves that needs to empower this change, and it has to be people sharing hearts. Reconciliation is transformation, is pushing us to do more than merely come up with a new set of policies that will make life easier for the institution. Reconciliation is transformation, is calling for something more than that. It's calling for an exchange of hearts. We have to change hearts. I remember this was driven home even when I joined the Christian Missionary Alliance Church as a minister in 1991. I started, and I got elected to the committee. First meeting, got elected to a committee that was overseeing this ministry. And the people asked us if they would talk to the denomination, because most denominations, when it comes to Indigenous church, are always cutting budgets and trying to think of ways to make Indigenous individuals fit within their existing churches, like it fit within the dominant church. They're always, underneath is always a process of assimilation, which they think is part of just good business practice or something, but it's always there. It's always there. And they wanted to meet with, they thought if we could just meet face to face with the board of the Christian Missionary Alliance, then it would change. Since 1991, they might have been requesting that before. So then we would write a letter, or we'd make a request to the board of the Christian Missionary Alliance. And the board would always say, well, we don't do that. We don't meet with ethnic churches as a whole. We just don't do that. But we kept after them till like 1996. They finally sent a lawyer and the vice president to talk with us. I always laugh because it was a lawyer. I don't know if there was any significance in that, but always a lawyer present. And I remember being in the basement of a little church building. Larry Wilson was there with me. Larry Wilson's from Peguis Reserve. And we said what we wanted. We said we want to meet with the board of it. And I remember the vice president, out of frustration, he says, "What do you people want?" You know, and we could have got all mad because he was saying "you people," but we didn't, because he was really just, I think he wanted to do something else, but he just didn't know how to get there. And I remember at that point, Larry Wilson says, "We want your heart. We want your heart. That's all we've ever wanted. That's all we ever wanted." And so we committed to try to meet and exchange hearts. That's what I mean by creating space. That's all you can do, is try to create space for something to happen. And we met and something did happen. But that's what institutions can do. They try to create space for something to happen. But institutions can't make it happen. It's really up to individuals, grassroots movements. Indigenous spirituality seems to understand this reality about reconciliation. A transformation is needed, because if we do not transform, change our basic understanding of things, then the systems that we have put in place will keep producing the same results. There was a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where the author, Patricia Vickers, in a paper I read by Patricia Vickers, she's Simpson, and she talks about how some organizations, in attempt to indigenize, what they would do, they would promote Indigenous people within their institution and put them into certain leadership roles. But because they weren't doing it, because it wasn't a transformative thing that was happening, sometimes Indigenous people were just as abusive as the non-Indigenous people that were in those roles before, because the system hadn't changed. We saw that a lot in Indian affairs. You know, the system was still the same, so it still continued to produce the same kinds of results. The recovery field tells us that what is needed is some kind of transformation. You need to sort of hit the bottom before you shift. People don't change unless they sort of have this powerful experience that causes them to see things differently. This does not mean that one event changes them forever, but it forms a catalyst for beginning the journey towards healing. We understand this in the Indigenous world, but I think we forget this at times. This is the purpose of ceremony, vision quests, those kinds of things. I talked about how I saw that Indigenous people begin on the heart level, and on the level where emotions play a more significant role in understanding than in the West. Emotion, instead of something to be avoided, can provide the strength to actually make changes. And I have experienced that in at least 2 areas where reconciliation has been and continues to be a journey, but is also sort of something, it is a destination that you're pressing towards, when all things will be reconciled one with another. The first event or thing that I was significant is in my life that helped shape my understanding of reconciliation was marriage encounter. In 1998, I was working 3 jobs in an effort to make God happy with me and provide enough money for my family to live. I was pastoring a church. I was the minister in the First Nations Alliance Church in Regina. I was also overseeing 8 other churches as the director of the First Nations Alliance Churches of Canada, which I received a little income. And then I was also a full-time student working on my Master of Divinity degree. I was running on adrenaline for that whole year. I thought this was what ministry was all about. You worked yourself until you were so tired and burnt out, because I was doing good, or I thought it would lead to reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, between Indigenous and the Creator. So I was doing that. And besides, the non-Indigenous church, like I said, were always threatening to cut off support, and they were intent on assimilating Indigenous people into the settler church. And I thought if I just worked hard enough, I could make a difference. In 1998, longtime friends of ours offered Elaine and I a chance to experience marriage encounter. The reality of doing ministry that way, of always giving yourself to the church and to the work of the church, meant that my marriage relationship was suffering. Elaine and I were living like 2 single people who happened to share the same house, because I was gone working I was gone a third of the time, I think, at that point. And I remember these friends of ours offered us a chance to go to a marriage encounter where we would experience 48 hours of love and where we would encounter ourselves, each other, and Jesus Christ. And I remember I was also in negotiation with the denomination about support for my ongoing work for them and what it would do and what it would look like. And I had an opportunity to sort of re-up for another 1-year stint of what I had been doing. And I remember I was talking with Elaine in our bedroom about this. And she said to me, without any malice on her part, she said, well, you can do that, but I'm going to die, she said. And I remember something happened in me, and I said, I picked up the phone and I called my friends back who I'd said no to a couple of days before. And I said, can we still go? And we did. And we did. At the event, Elaine and I told the truth. We listened. We came up with a shared plan. We listened and we realized that we needed to shift. And well, the event helped us to feel love for one another, but then we had to change our approach to life. This is the journey part. It sort of got us back to, had feelings for one another again, but we had to change our journey. Otherwise, we'd end up just the same place we'd be before. So we went to marriage encounter. We started practicing some tools about connecting heart to heart. And we were on a journey towards becoming one. But even as we move in our relationship as becoming one, it's not that we feel like we're becoming something we were never meant to be. It feels like we're becoming who we were created to be, which is what true reconciliation is about. Second event was what I shared about last week, Inanamoan. Again, we met and talked. You meet and talk for 4 days about what was going on inside. We leaned into the pain and we embraced the emotions so you could understand the lies that we had believed about ourselves. And we began to believe again that there was a different approach to life that did not avoid the pain of relationship, but sought to develop a healthier walk on the journey, seeing all of our relationships moving towards health. My point here is only that it was a transformative event that shifted to a journey about receiving love and being loved. And my fear in the whole reconciliation process that people will think that it's just an event that you do. It's a series of meetings and then it's done and then you just move on. But reconciliation is really what we're called to do, isn't it? I just think now, mainline denominations are probably different than holiness denominations. I was ordained in a holiness denomination, Christian Missionary Alliance. A.B. Simpson was a Presbyterian minister and thought he had a deeper movement of God. And maybe that's what Reformed people do when they have a deeper movement of God. They don't know what to do with all that emotion, so they start a new denomination. I'm not sure, but somehow we forget that salvation is about reconciliation. I mean, that's what Colossians says. It's about all things, the fullness of all things dwells in him, in the church, which is his body. Like it's about all things coming into reconciling all things, that reconciliation is salvation. And it's about transformation, that all things are becoming new, that all things are becoming new. And that's what reconciliation is about. It's about being created and recreated. And somehow we forget that. I mean, I think about this need for ongoing transformation that's occurred. You can read about it in the church and in Acts of the Apostles, when they have new cultural groups coming into the church. There's misunderstanding and there's sometimes persecution or ignoring of the other. And yet the church meets in Jerusalem around Acts 15 and realizes that it has to change fundamentally if it's going to resolve this enmity that is existing. And it does. And it does. It's converted and transformed. Of course, it's debated whether reconciliation can be transformative. This is still debated because, as I said, institutions continue to do reconciliation, or that word reconciliation, to disguise the desire to placate people to fit the program. I have no doubt that sometimes organizations use apology to try to placate people, to make them stop complaining. And somehow they think that people will just get on with the program. And then, and at the same time, it uses sometimes reconciliation events seem to neuter any impetus for change. My friend Andrea Smith wrote an essay about this, that during the 1990s, Promise Keepers, which is an organization trying to affirm men in their identity, it was actually I think it had a good idea. I don't think they intended to be misogynist. I think they were trying to call men to something higher. And but in that whole thing, they would have these reconciliation gatherings. They called it, I mean, the first time I went to it was 1996. It wasn't Promise Keepers, but they were having this conference on reconciliation in Colorado Springs. It was my first time in the United States. I think it was 1996, I think. Anyways, went to this conference, and they were doing this thing called representative repentance. And they would have this event where there would be someone who represented, settlers, and the settlers would apologize, and there would be someone who represented Indigenous people, and they would receive the apology, and then forgiveness would be intended, and you celebrated, and you had a big worship service, which was fun. And then, but I don't know that it actually caused any change in society. I don't know that it caused any change in society. And so my friend Andrew, and this was happening in Promise Keepers as well. And Andrea Smith just noted that these events, these reconciliation events, just seem to neuter any impetus for real change on an institutional level that would dismantle some of the systemic racism that existed in the institution. So I understand that could, and it's still debated on whether or not it can be effective. But I think but we still have this, we still want to press on towards reconciliation in the Indigenous community, because it's what we're called to do. It's what we're called to do. And I think that we can understand this if we think about what it is to be a human being, or at least I've come to understand it, I should say. In all of these lectures, all I can offer is the understanding I think that I've come to understand. Looking at the world through the Indigenous eyes of my ancestors has helped me to understand that the creative work of God is all about being human, and to be human is all about learning to be dependent within the relationships all around us. I talked in previous lectures about Vine Deloria because he was trying to bring awareness to the ways that things needed to be transformed. The West was consumed with reducing all human beings to autonomous individuals, or maybe a better way to say it was he observed that the West was consumed with autonomous individuals with grasping after rights, and the good life was all about writing laws or affirming somehow and protecting individual rights. But what was lost in all that was the relationship. The idea of the autonomous individual is a caricature of what it is to be human being. It denies the basic understanding that can be gained from merely observing life. We are always in the midst of relationship. There is no solitary life. There is no solitary life. We're always in the midst of relationship. There is never a time when we can step outside of those relationships to believe that our actions do not impact others is a basic misunderstanding of creation. The solution, Dolores said, and we talked about it, is to embrace Indigenous boundaries of creation and of land, creation or land and social relationships that teach us how to live in harmony with one another. And it teaches us what not to do, what not to do. It's more difficult to live in a city. The good thing about growing up in the country is that the land itself will teach you, and it'll teach your children, because if I learned that if I didn't listen to what my mom and dad told me, creation itself taught me that I should listen to them. If my mom told me not to walk in water over the top of my boots, and if I didn't listen to my mother, that puddle, the land would teach me what would happen. I'd have wet feet and I have cold feet just because I don't listen to my mother. So I learned to listen to my mother. It's tougher in the city. It's more unforgiving than the land. If you play in the street and get hit by a car, there's no coming back from that. So I understand that, but the idea was that the land would teach you about where you could go and what you could do and the boundaries that you could cross, where the boundaries were. But we've lost that. And in Indigenous, but looking through my Indigenous ancestors' eyes, relationship was expanded to not only include relationship with God, which modern Western Christianity focuses almost entirely upon, partly because maybe the other relationships were taken for granted for years. But Indigenous understanding saw spirituality as tied to how we lived out our relationships with others as being as important as the relationship with the Creator, or should I say there was no relationship with the Creator outside of relationship with everything else. It was all seen as one. Relationship defined how we see our significance, not primarily upon what we do, but how we are related. Indigenous boundaries means that we learn how to live in community from our relatives, which included not only Creator, but creation and creatures. So Deloria thought one of the solutions for people was to embrace Indigenous boundaries and begin to understand that our lives are really defined and lived out in the context of relationship. Deloria said also that we should embrace Indigenous communal identity. And we talked about this, including the land. Indigenous communal identity includes the land, or always takes place in the land, and is exemplified. I talked about that in Indigenous Treaty. It's understanding our creation story and how we are related to the earth and those who share this good world with us. And we live this out, and our journey is always about continue to write the story, the shared story of how we live out the harmony that's all around us. And it is a journey towards being dependent on one another, not independent. This is against the idea of a society that sees no value in elders, for example. Remember, elders are the ones who hold the memory of how we live in relationship for Indigenous people. But our modern society has become so focused upon independence and by earning significance by what you do, that anyone who is older and who can't do as much, we believe, is dependent upon us is seen as a burden to society and of no value. Because they cannot produce or do something that we deem value, they are seen as valueless. An Indigenous understanding, the journey towards being human begins as dependent upon our mother and family. You're dependent when you're a baby. And maturity is about learning to take care of your mother. That's what I learned from my father, that when you're a boy, you're dependent upon your mom and you grow in maturity, you learn how to take care of your mom. That's what your job is. That's what and then as we get older, we become dependent upon those younger than us. I tease my kids, I say, when you were little, I changed your diapers, and when I'm old, you'll have to change my diapers. But it's the journey. And that doesn't make us of no value. But we're on this journey of being truly human, to be dependent upon one another, to be dependent and embrace our journey as human beings. We learn to be good at, we need to be good at consensus. And if you're gonna do the work of reconciliation, you have to learn how to understand consensus. Consensus is having the ability, or it's the ability to put into a story or narrative all the feelings and ideas of the community so that they can move ahead with hope towards a destination when all things will be in harmony and with one another. The idea of consensus is being able to listen to everyone and then cast a vision where, for unity, where people feel affirmed that they've been heard. Maybe everyone doesn't agree completely with us, but we can see that we're on this journey. We're on this journey together, and we feel affirmed as human beings, and we can move together, move ahead together. We learn from the narratives in the land all around us. One of the things you learn if you listen to Indigenous story, and I think you learn it if you listen to scripture, and two, is that it's often the small that show wisdom. It's often the small. The wisest creature, according to the Crow First Nations, is the chickadee. The wisest bird is the chickadee, because the chickadee listens and looks with wisdom to all things, and so understands. And if you're around chickadees, you know they're always listening. They're always listening. The grandmother field mouse, I tell a story about, often in stories, grandmother field mouse is the one that in the end gives wisdom. That is in a small voice, a small, steady voice, continues to speak wisdom. Grandmothers and mothers are the ones who can fix anything in Indigenous stories, and they hold society together. That's why many of our Indigenous groups are matrilineal, that the clan mothers are the ones that give direction. I remember the Mohawk, the clan mothers, the grandmothers picked the chief, and it was often a man they picked, but the grandmothers chose the chief because they've known these men since they were babies, since they were in diapers. They understood who they were. They knew them. They knew everything about them. Those things that our modern society treat with little value because they're out of the ordinary. This is another thing. Anything out of the ordinary, or what modern society calls normal, is treated as not being very valuable. But in Indigenous society, these are the sacred things. These are the sacred things. The out of the ordinary possess an understanding and perspective that no one else has, and so it must be needed by the community, for why else would they be given to the community? Thus, my son, who the world calls disabled, he's sacred. He's a sacred being. He possesses understanding and perspective that none of the rest of us in my family have. And so he has wisdom, and we listen to that wisdom. It's not something, my son is sacred. It's not something that's the result of sin, which some theology seems to propose, that disability and all of those things that don't fit what society calls normal, it's all part of sin. Well, we don't understand it that way. It's sacred. There are others who are disregarded by society as a whole, but those are sacred too. The sacred appears to teach us something, and we need to make sure to make room so we can hear. So we can hear what the Creator is saying. The sacred reminds us to listen. And if you're going to do reconciliation, you need to listen. This is not out of keeping with Christian theology. Dietrich Bonhoeffer points out that Christ fails in the eyes of the world by becoming weak. But Bonhoeffer talks about it as failure. He fails in the eyes of the world by becoming weak, but in doing so becomes strong for the whole world. The Gospel of Mark reminds us that following Christ means that we will suffer. 3 times in the Gospel of Mark, Christ says to his disciples, I'm going to go up to Jerusalem and I will be crucified and I will rise again on the 3rd day. And they just can't get their head around it. They can't get their head around it. In fact, Mark goes out of the way that the disciples are sort of thick between the horns and they just never seem to quite get it. And we're supposed to read Mark and realize we're just like those disciples. We just don't always understand. We give away our life and embrace our suffering. We give away our life and embrace our suffering because in the midst of this, we encounter Christ and we encounter ourselves and we meet others. On the level of human suffering is where we can meet heart to heart, heart to heart. Indigenous understanding does not launch us into some new form of, I just want to make sure that you understand that Indigenous understanding is lived for the community. Like you live your life for the sake of the community, but that does not mean that this doesn't launch us into some sort of socialism or communism that sacrifices the individual for the sake of some vision of community. Indigenous understanding allows me to embrace my freedom as a human being. No one has a right to tell me what to do. However, my relatedness to all means that I must take all my relatives into consideration in my decisions. We understand that we pray for good hunting and give thanks for good hunting. And this teaches us that we live by our relatives giving themselves for us. We then learn from creation to give ourselves away in love for our relatives so that they can live. And so the idea of reconciliation is that we're trying to shift society, which is the church has always tried to talk about. I just thought it might learn from Indigenous understanding to see how these things are taught by creation itself, if we would just open our eyes and think about them. Together, we're on this journey of being human beings, learning to live in complete dependence upon all of our relatives, all of our relatives. Reconciliation is a journey and destination. Reconciliation has been a journey. It's been a 30-year journey for me since I first really started thinking about what it would be like. It has included events that helped me to feel and then caused me to use the energy from those feelings and embrace the transformation that God was working in my life or is working in my life. It is always a combination of creator and creation working to transform me. My friend Michael Jacobs, who's a singer, he has a little spoken word piece where he talks about the creator, and he says the creator continues to create and recreate until creator says that's it, and it'll be done. My last point here, I want to tell you how I've tried to hold Western Christian faith and Indigenous spirituality or understanding together. So in my own mind, there could be an ongoing reconciliation of ideas that might help us in this journey towards harmonious relationship. It's not like Western Christianity is all bad, or that the newcomers are all bad and just can never understand. And it's not that Indigenous understanding is all good. They're equal. They're equal. They're ways of thinking about things, and you need to hold them together. And as I've studied theology, especially after the graduation last night, because you think about how you've been involved as people learn, as people learn, you get to be part of that journey. I was thinking about how I've tried to hold these things together in my life. I've tended to use Western theologians and writers in my thought. What has been helpful me to look at these writers, but it's been helpful to look at them through Indigenous eyes, because it makes me understand things in different ways. It made it come alive to me. Leslie Newbigin points out that as you do mission, for example, or engage in a cross-cultural work, one of the unexpected benefits is you begin to see your own way of thinking and seeing in new ways. Sometimes you're surprised at what you discover, maybe some not so positive things that were in you because you're in a different situation, you're able to see those things. Anyway, Western thinkers have some good ideas, and they often open up the way or point out something that's significant to me, and then I see if that is, so what I've tended to do is to see if that's within Indigenous understanding as well. There are often small ideas in Western thought, but I find them significant in critiquing colonial society. After all, the academy is good at deconstructing things, and if we're trying to deconstruct or decolonize, I mean, the academy might be helpful. And besides, I notice that many theologians are dissatisfied with the state of the church and how it's been captured by Christendom. I think the Reformation was spawned in part because of the abuses that Luther and others saw that were ongoing in the institutional church. The church, however, finds it difficult to change. I don't think anybody likes colonial society, but we are used to it. And sometimes maybe the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. I don't know, but we just find it hard to change. And anyway, I wanted to stitch together in closing a few ideas over the years that have helped me in this journey. They helped me because I was looking for words to describe what I was feeling and understanding with regard to being Indigenous, and wanting to describe the gift that I had been given by my Indigenous ancestors. And I thought that it was Indigenous wisdom that existed in this country and that other peoples could learn from it. I thought these ideas could help us as we embrace reconciliation as a journey, always seeking to live out reconciliation as a journey, but also understanding it as a goal of what we do as human beings. One of these ideas, I remember when I read Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I think he said, it's how I remember it anyways, if you make community your goal, you've lost it already. You've lost it already. I thought I was reading about the Indigenous church. We were a group of people who had come together because we did not have much and we were facing persecution from the larger church. Remember, the larger church is always trying to strip away support for Indigenous churches. It's like they're trying to convince us that we really can't stand alone, that we really should stand alone. I should say that we really should be isolated from everyone else, and we should just, if we can't stand alone, that we should just fit into existing churches. But in the Indigenous church in Regina, we came together around the gospel and around Jesus because we sensed that Jesus understood what we were going through and was our only hope. But this was not something you could manufacture. And we found there was community there, but it wasn't something you could manufacture. It was created by the Spirit in the midst of embracing the pain. There was community. There was community. It required that we do life together by sharing what we had and by speaking from the heart. It means you have to make room for diversity in your own heart because we understood that we needed one another. That's what I learned. And it requires that we embrace those significantly different than us, but we do that on the level of human suffering by taking care of one another. It is Indigenous people, newcomers, and creation that the Creator holds together, and we are trying to live out this harmony. Life together reminded me that as we did life, as we lived life, as we were living life together reminded me as we were living life just above the poverty level, just above the poverty level. And we understand that we needed one another, but we would celebrate. We would celebrate together, even though we didn't have anything. There was these celebrations because we were on this journey, and it felt like we were slowly putting relationships back together. The signs of life, says Henry Nouwen, are intimacy, fecundity, and ecstasy. He wrote that in a book called Life Signs. He said the enemy of life is fear. Yet we live in a world in which we are always tempted to live out of fear instead of out of love. Love, however, is the key to living in harmony and the key to reconciliation. In fact, if you read about Joseph and his brothers, they're afraid. One of the things that appears to going to throw reconciliation sideways is they're afraid that their brother, Joseph, is going to punish them for what they've done in the past. Even right now, many newcomers, the settler church, as some people call it, although I don't like that word, settler church. The church in Canada sometimes fear that it's going to be punished by Indigenous people. I think that's why lawyers always show up with vice presidents at meetings. They're always afraid that you're going to say something. It's going to mean that you have to pay something. I don't know. But that's not life. Intimacy is the experience of knowing and of being known. We all desire a place where we understand that people know who we are and yet they love us anyways. And in the same way, we know and we love anyways. This is the journey and destination of reconciliation. This is salvation as defined by Scripture. It's all coming, and it's all things coming together. It's the picture of intimacy and solidarity. It's the experience of knowing that Jesus likes me, that Jesus likes me. We could create places where we understood that Jesus loves us and he likes us. I think we'd see reconciliation radiating out from the midst of us. That yet in this world we live in, we're tempted to just huddle together in fear. That's not intimacy, that's clinging. And many of us found us that. That's one of the challenges of overcoming COVID, right? Many times what we had was not intimacy. We were just clinging together out of fear. And we're trying to come together again, and it's difficult. Yet in the world we live, this is what we need to do. This is the gift of God in Christ Jesus, for he knows us fully and we are fully known by him, to live out this love, to experience the love of the Creator and live that out in our relationship. That's intimacy. Fecundity or fruitfulness, life comes out of us even when we're broken. Jesus teaches us this, and we understand as we look at our lives of our elders that there was life coming out of them. Even in the midst of, the things that spawned reconciliation movements were Indigenous people who were suffering and yet continued to ask for reconciliation, pursue reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out of the desire by survivors of residential school to see reconciliation, because they understood what happens if you don't pursue reconciliation. You're locked into a never-ending struggle of vendetta and revenge, and it just never ends. Violence cannot produce peace. It cannot produce peace. At best, although sometimes violence seems necessary, there needs to be a limited amount of violence so that it can sort of restore the moral order, but it's still up to people to come together on a heart level to find relationship, intimacy, fruitfulness, and ecstasy or celebration. Most people are so insecure because of their fear of being hurt, they rarely sense the ecstasy or celebration of life. I started off by saying the Western world is defined by its need for significance through what they did. And it pursues this with purpose. Its purpose in bringing the kingdom of God to earth failed. It failed to be able to celebrate what was just going on all around us, to celebrate that we're in a good land. We're in a good land. I learned about this. So now it says, I always remember that because for a while in the, I think there was a purpose-driven church and a purpose-driven life and a purpose-driven, I don't know, they had purpose-driven anything to read someone who says, you know, the problem with purpose is you never celebrate because you never get there. You never get there. Again, that's why I want to talk about reconciliation as a journey and a destination. I saw the ceremony nature of life of the Cree, and it helped me understand this reality. I repeated this phrase a few times. I heard it from Grand Chief Arthur Noski, that the heart of our spirituality was in the fall, we pray for good hunting. And in the spring, we give thanks for good hunting. Our lives are sustained by the Creator and our relatives all around us in creation. We do our part by giving thanks and by praying, but we understand that animals give themselves to us because they feel sorry for us. We are not carrying the land. It is carrying us. We're not, we're not the mother of creation. We don't care for it like a child. But our mother, the earth, she cares for us. She cares for us. We do our part, but we understand that it's the grace of the Creator that sustains us. And so then every time that you eat, I remember reading this book in the Cree narrative. He's talking about the Cree up by James Bay, but every time they eat, it's a feast. It's a feast. Every time you eat, it's a feast. Because you remember that it's your relatives that are sustaining you. It's always your relatives that are sustaining you. It's the relationship. And so you celebrate. We give thanks. It's a celebration. Not because it will lead to something else, but because it's a good land and it's a good journey that we're on, and it's good. And that transferred when the gospel came into Indigenous communities. We gather around the gospel, even in the midst of suffering. And in the midst of suffering, we celebrate that we're still here and that we are related to all things. And we are on this journey towards reconciliation. And we are doing our part by living and speaking and from the heart to try and come together with the newcomers so that our children and grandchildren could continue to live on this journey of all things coming together in perfect harmony. The harmony we see in Jesus Christ, fully human, fully divine, Creator and creation in perfect harmony. We continue on this journey of reconciliation and look forward to the destination when all things will be held together in Him. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. And I hope you have some questions. But if not, that's okay too. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you so much, Ray. Really another wonderful lecture, so very helpful. Thank you for your gentle way and for a good way you propose of reconciliation, and for I enjoyed today how so many things came together there at the end. All the different facets of your life and experience, and really grateful for you sharing those with you. To us. Folks, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box now or into the Q&A. Either way, we'll find them and raise them with Ray. You were superbly clear, Ray.
Good.
Ray, here's a question. Thank you, Ray. Do you think organizations dampen or control celebrations?
Yeah.
Mhm.
The idea that Nowen has was, and the reason we were celebrating, we were doing this work trying to create a safe place for people who had suffered abuse.
Mhm.
Because one of the things about when you start to believe all these lies about yourself is that you tend to use things to try to make yourself feel better, and you rarely. So then, I think Jacques Ellul talks about that church has become a form of escapism, and that's not what we're trying to do. But we're trying to realize that even though we'd suffered these things, that Jesus still liked us. He still did. Wanted to help us work through things, but we would, and it was in that somehow we sensed that even though we were broken, life was coming out through us, and we'd found help. And I mean, I think AA says, you found help, go help somebody. And we were finding this was true. Not that we had to be perfectly healed. So organizations can dampen celebration in that it's always so exhausting. It's always so exhausting. And it seems like you only celebrate if you do a bunch of stuff, so you're always feeling inadequate. I think if you can be emotionally honest and provide space for people to actually, be real about what they're experiencing, and then that provides us to celebrate even in the midst of difficulties. So I really think that, and some organizations are better at that than others. So that's how I see it anyways.
Thanks, Ray. There's a question here. Please speak a little bit more about consensus.
Okay, consensus. I tried to come up with a different understanding of consensus because I often heard people using consensus as a way to keep anything from happening. This was the dark side of consensus, is that individuals will think all they have to do is keep voting no and nothing will happen because we can't get everybody to agree. And that wasn't how consensus was working. I saw in Indigenous communities, really. Well, how consensus worked was it was built on relationship, that you developed relationship with people. And then you were just listening to people. So when you finally put forward sort of a direction to go, it was something that everyone could acknowledge had good, there was good in it, that we could at least go along with it, even if we didn't agree completely, that we could proceed in that direction. It's a little slower, it takes a little more time. And it also requires, actually I heard a church planting person talk about this, you got to pay the rent. A good part of what you do as a church or an organization is paying the rent. You gotta work on developing relationships with people. You can't treat people like they're I don't know, that they have to listen to you, or you gotta listen. You gotta hang out together and listen to people. And that consensus used by lots of good leaders, not just Indigenous people, non-Indigenous leaders. I think good ones are good at consensus. They can listen enough, listen to people so that everyone, and when they speak, everyone feels like, and it's not just something that is being done to control the group. They really do have hope and a vision, and people can move ahead. That's how I think about consensus. It also requires that you need to take responsibility for the discord that exists sometimes as a leader. Can't spend all your time explaining why you're innocent. That's not helpful. Just best to take responsibility and try to figure out how to work through it. I learned some skills in that from counseling. That just a good counseling skill that I learned was just talking about what was really going on inside of me and not blaming somebody else for what was going on, just learning how to speak that. So, and this all helped proved helpful when you're talking about reconciliation. So hope that helps.
Thanks, Ray. A question here. I've heard that some Indigenous people will only find healing if the Pope apologizes in Canada. Can you speak to that?
I think what they are desiring is a good thing. I don't know. I don't know them, so I can't say if they're saying that, but the Pope cannot apologize for the sins of the Pope because that's just theologically impossible. That's my understanding. But the Pope will apologize for what some Catholics did. And if that helps people move in their journey, then that's a good thing. I just thought of it. When Stephen Harper apologized in 2008 and the other leaders, except for the Bloc Québécois, I don't think he actually apologized. I'm not sure what he did. I couldn't understand exactly what he was trying to say. But when Stephen Harper made that apology, many people talked about whether or not he was sincere or not. I think he was hoping it would placate some people and the government wouldn't face so big of a settlement because, maybe people would lighten up because he apologized. Regardless of that, Indigenous people used it. They used it to move in their healing. And I think that many people are thinking that could be helpful to their people. I don't know that they're just saying that because they're worried about themselves. I think they're thinking that their communities and they still think there are many who want to be Catholic, and they just think it would help them and their communities to move ahead in their healing if the Pope would just come and acknowledge and offer apology for what happened. And so then, because they haven't in Canada to a great degree, because the Catholic Church in Canada, my understanding is there's no, like in the Presbyterian Church, there's a head of the Presbyterian Church who represents all of the Presbyterian churches in Canada. In the Anglican Church, there's a primate who represents all of the churches in Canada. And the United Church as well. There's a moderator whoever the moderator is can be a spokesperson for all the churches. But the Catholic don't have that in Canada. But they have a Pope, and the Pope is supposed to universally be over. So now finally the Pope's coming to Canada, and he could apologize, and it'll help people move in their journey of healing. Because they want to do the work, but it'll help them. That's how I understand. Hope that's not too confusing.
Thanks, Ray. There's a longer question here about the connection between finding harmony between us and the rest of the world and the challenge of climate change. And it comes to the question at the end. I'd like to ask what spiritual resources you discover in your tradition in terms of how to deal with the frustration and sense of despair caused by the current challenges of climate change. I take it whose symptoms are becoming more and more obvious.
Oh, yeah. Well, I could just riff off the speaker last night at graduation.
Yeah.
I think that, but from spiritual resources, so then it's actually, I heard it from a friend of mine. He put it better than I did, Mark Lavasia. He just said, we understand that the land cares for us. It cares for us. This means we need to honor the land, and we do that by giving thanks and by making sure that you only take what's necessary, and that you always plan in a way so that you don't deplete the resources of the land. But those are all part of Indigenous understanding of how to live in harmony with creation. But that idea that it seems like a lot of fear is that we believe that somehow it's up to us alone, and our task is to live out the harmony that we see all around us. And so that's what we try to do, to try to live with honor and respect. So one thing that I remember, I heard about a geologist working with pipeline crews. They pray together as a crew and remind one another that they're working in Mother Earth to take care in all their welds to make sure they do a good job, so that, you know, spills don't happen, those kinds of things. This is serious work we're doing. This is not just a job. We're trying to honor all of our relationships and what we're doing. That would be, I just think that when you're bringing in a whole nother set of emotions then, and you're giving back meaning and purpose to what we're doing, and we're not just laborers who are selling our hours for some pay, but we're doing something that has impact for all our relationships for generations to come. And that's a gift that we've been given, but it's also a responsibility that we have. That's the best resource I could think of. Helps me to understand that.
Thanks so much, Ray. Just coming back to a previous answer, someone said, could you say more about what you mean by the Pope not being able to apologize for the sins of the Pope?
Well, because the Pope's not possible for him to sin in his office when he speaks. So then it just doesn't happen. It's theologically not going to happen. I don't know. I think about that. The only reason I say that is because sometimes people are so intent on getting things to happen that just are not possible to get to happen. And I just think they put a lot of energy into something that there's probably no chance of occurring. So I'm a strong believer in, I'm pragmatic. I'm pragmatic at times. What's the best we can get here? What's the best we can get? Because I think if it's all or nothing, you usually end up with nothing. That's my experience in life. So you got to ask, what's the best we can get here? Because we're working with, we tend to be hard to get along with. Maybe no one else is, but I tend to be. So then you got to learn how to say, okay, what's the best we can get here? So I think sometimes people are saying things like, when it comes to the earth, for example, that we gotta eliminate fossil fuels. Well, that's a good goal, but you're not going to do it tomorrow. So you somehow got to have the gaps between then and now. And when it comes to the Catholic Church, they have a certain theology that prevents them from actually doing certain things because it's just not in the vocabulary. You can't do it because you can't say it. It's not there. So I don't know. I know I'm not making sense, but I think the infallibility of the Pope means that he cannot apologize for the sins of the Pope. He can apologize for the sins of the church, Catholics within the church committing sin, but not for the sin of the Pope. So that's my understanding. Richard, you're a better theologian than I am, but that's
thank you for your answer. I appreciate it, Ray. Ray, there's a question here about how can the church reconcile two-spirit Indigenous individuals when the global church is intent on excluding these people?
Well, that's a great question. I've tried different things. I thought maybe that whole thing about sacred, I thought there was room in there. But again, it's not perfect. I understand that, because you still end up, I don't want to call people not normal. I just hate that. I hate that idea. Like, it goes back to my son. Now my son believes that there shouldn't be, at least at one point he used to say, there shouldn't be special stalls for handicapped people. He believed that every stall in a bathroom should be accessible, that that's the way we should think about things. We shouldn't just make certain allowances because we have to for certain people. We should just realize that we should just make bigger room for people. But I also understand that you have to help people move. And I just thought the idea is sacred. That if someone was in society who like two-spirited, the idea of two-spirit is that you could see things from simultaneously from two perspectives, like both the male and female, or maybe even if there's another one, but you could see a perspective in a different way, that was a gift. And that's why they had been placed there by the creator, that perspective was important. And it was up to the community to try to understand how that worked together with the community. So then I think that I thought maybe that would help, but sometimes I'm not even sure that would help, because I know, because I used to teach and I'd say, well, how about this? But some of my students said, no, that's not going to work. And it's not that as individuals, they weren't willing, but as individuals within larger institutional churches, they didn't know how to overcome that. So I guess we have to continue to try to put forward ideas about how we could move in a better direction. And I see that there's movement in North America, I always think, but you also have to realize it's a journey. That's how it fits in too, because if you think you've arrived, then I think you can end up going backwards quickly, because you think you just don't have to continue to put that work in. So,
Ray, a question here in the Q&A box. What is your vision for the future of the Indigenous Studies Program in relationship to the churches at VST?
Oh, yeah. My vision is that we continue to be a place that listens and responds to the Indigenous Church, and try to put into place programs and courses that meet their desire for where they want to go. In that way, I think that community, at this point anyways, community-based learning is a significant part of that. I think it might mean that we move towards even smaller incremental learning, and that you offer courses in even more episodic ways, so that you come and you break a course into 3 parts. And we've done that before, but maybe we continue to think about that. I continue to think that it would be a place that we could begin to work deeper into what it means to be a self-determining church, to develop the vision. And then, because anytime you have a movement, you need to develop institutional structure. Institutions aren't the enemy. They just have certain qualities about them that you got to work to mitigate certain things. And so I just think that we could probably shift towards that. I'd like to see us hire another professor, an Indigenous professor, so that we'd have a couple Indigenous professors in VST. And then I'd like to see us continue to move to develop or reinvent the mentoring relationship that is, it looks good on paper, but it struggles at times to find folks who want to do that in the program. I'm not giving a very good answer. Well, I'm 62 years old. I mean, I don't know if I'm the one to give vision, but I think I'd like to find someone who could give vision, so that in about 3 years they could take over.
I hope it's longer than 3 years, but that's just a comment, Ray. Here, why did you join the Anglican Church of Canada? Is this a good place for Indigenous Christians to be seen and heard?
Yeah, I was inspired by the Indigenous Anglican Church because they had this vision for ministry that I wasn't seeing other denominations. The bent in most denominations in Canada, as I said, is to always be cutting resources, and they lack the vision for an Indigenous church. And it's not that those things are not in the Anglican church, but I don't know, it was happening in the Anglican church, and it was really a grassroots movement that was building from the bottom up. So then there were more and more Indigenous bishops, and then they continued to press towards models that affirmed Indigenous communities. And then I just thought it was not a bad place to hang my hat right now. And I was inspired by the leadership of the Indigenous Anglican Church, or I am inspired by the leadership. And I thought it had spirituality, and it brought together Indigenous identity and Christian faith. Now, other denominations are trying to do that, but they struggle with the structure. Someone asked me that once in Calgary, which denomination was doing the best job. And I could only comment on the ones that I know. And the Anglican Indigenous Church had a vision. And they had resources from the denomination to do that. And that was lacking in other. One or the other was always lacking in others. So if I had to compare, but I don't do that.
Thanks, Ray. There's a number of comments, they're not really questions, but just comments on how people have found what you've had to say, Ray, very helpful, and how your sharing has enriched their lives. But here's a question. I'm a cradle Catholic, and my journey in the Catholic Church since the revelation about residential schools has been ongoing education, and I can't thank you enough for what you've offered here. Among other parts of your talk, I take with me something that you said: thinking and seeing in new ways will help me be transformed by reconciliation. So again, a comment there.
Yeah, you have to actually be committed to reconciliation. Like you can't just spend the rest of your life being miserable about things like that. As much as that, and that's one of the things when you're trying to sort of, I don't know. One of the things about when you're journeying through trauma is and hurt, deep hurt. At some point, you have to. I don't know if you have to, but at some point, you need to move into the world again, even though it's painful. And sometimes I just noticed it in myself. Staying mad at someone might make me feel powerful at times, but it just makes me sick after a while. It just makes me sick. And I don't know if that's forgiveness, but at some point you have to just let God deal with them, because I don't want to deal with them anymore. So I'm just gonna set them aside. And maybe that's not that's part of the journey, I think.
Right, to your knowledge, the Alliance Church, is it actively implementing the TRC calls for action? Is it encouraging individual churches to do so?
Probably. But sometimes institutions get caught up, they just want to check the box. And that's what I was trying to say today. Like, because that's it. Institutions have so many things going on. One of the things I realized, we had this reconciliation gathering at the Christian Missionary Alliance. And it was significant because there were other things happening within the Christian Missionary Alliance Church at the time. And for 2 years, relationship was the point for 2 years. And then we shifted again, I think, away from that. because there's a shift that happens in denominations, not just the Christian Missionary Alliance. I mean, it happens in all of them. There's a shift that you can, so then that's why I say it's a destination. So then the focus is on relationship, and you realize that is the whole point, is about good relationship. But then sometimes you can be tempted to shift, because in a business model, you think, I'm going to use these relationships to produce these numbers. And when you make that shift, there's something that what ends up happening is you end up treating people in a utilitarian fashion. And if they don't satisfy you, then you get rid of them.
Like human resources, right? You know?
Yeah. And lots of people write about that. Lots of people write about that. So.
Well, thanks to everyone. Boy, this has been a great group every week. Lots of great questions. Hearing what you say to us tonight, I come to think that many profound theological thoughts have been deeply personalized in you through honest reflection and deep love for your tradition and others. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I could not find many theologians who have an Indigenous background. Are there some theologians or philosophers whose writings you would like to recommend to us?
Well, sure. Yeah. Well, Richard Twist, he was a friend of mine. I went to school with him, and then he passed on too early. He wrote a book called Saving the Gospel from the Cowboys. That was a good book. I think it's a good book. Randy Woodley has just come out with Western Society, Western Theology and Indigenous People. Randy Woodley's a good friend of mine. I like his stuff. There's a book called Terry LeBlanc's a good writer. Anything you can find by Terry's good. Who else? Andy Smith. Her stuff's good. Patricia Vickers' stuff is amazing. She does the best stuff when it comes to abuse, trauma, and the impact it has on our brain and things like that. And I think her stuff is amazing. And there's other people who aren't, they wouldn't. Martin Brokenleg. Anything Martin Brokenleg writes is amazing. And he's two-spirited, and he just does a great job of talking about how he actually does a great job. I remember hearing him talk about spirituality of self-determination. I thought it was profound. And there's a book called Coming Full Circle, edited by Steve Charleston. Anyways, I'm sorry, I'm just going on, but those are some of the Indigenous writers. But I also appreciate some non-Indigenous writers who write, like all those folks who came out of the Second World War, who had to deal with the Holocaust or were caught in that thing. And they're not just Christian writers, but Jewish writers too, the folks who had to deal with that. There is such a depth of understanding in what they write. And it's impacted me in my career and in my life as a theologian. So, the Bonhoeffers, Jacques Ellul, Karl Barth, Viktor Frankl, Elie Wiesel, and all those, Frank. So, anyways,
well,
take a course in theology. I just think there's always something good. It's always, a mentor of mine said, I just assume that everybody's committed, and that's how I live my life. And I thought, I like that. So that's how I'm trying to live my life.
Well, thank you very much, Ray. We're coming to the end of our half hour. Ray, would it be inappropriate for me to ask you to close our time together with a blessing?
Sure. I wouldn't be inappropriate, so I didn't know how to.
Very
I will
good.
do that.
You've done it before.
Well, I'm going to just pray for everyone. Creator, I thank you for your goodness to us and for all of our relatives, wherever we are. And we desire that you would help us be agents of reconciliation, that would flow out of us. Help us, so we open our hearts to you, that you would pour in by your Spirit, your grace, your love. And that give us the wisdom and the eyes to see and be channels of that love to those all around us. And that you would draw us together. And Father, I pray, Father, Mother, Creator, that you would heal our land, that you would heal our land and our lands. And we thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ray, for all of these lectures. And folks, if you're looking for them, the 4 of them can be found. It was in both the Q&A and in the chat box, the link to the VST YouTube channel where you can see them. So thanks again, Ray.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Joseph.
Yes, thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Dr. Richard and Dr. Ray.